Good afternoon. Welcome very much to Arundel House. There's a discussion meeting around the launch of our new book, Africa's Lost Leader. I'm delighted to have James Hamill with me, but also Professor Jack Spence of King's, which is why my comments are going to be incredibly brief. The book is an analysis of South Africa's relations and engagement with the rest of Africa over three presidencies. It looks not only at government to government, but also company relations, people to people relations as well. There's quite an extensive section also on South African Defence Forces. Conclusions are quite strong, and we hope that it will have, thank you, a good take-up. We're very interested in your comments. So James will speak first, Jack will make a few remarks, and then I hope we'll have about a half an hour at the end for a discussion. Without further ado, James.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Nick, and thanks to everyone involved here at the Institute for putting on the book launch. I want to say particular thanks to the editorial team I've worked with over the last 2 years on the project, Nick himself, Chris, who's no longer here, Gaynor and Tom. I also want to say a big thanks to my old comrade Jack Spence, sitting to my left, and it's without Jack's passionate commitment to South African studies, I certainly wouldn't have written the book, and I certainly wouldn't be sitting here. Jack was my lecturer back in the almost the dawn of time now, back in the late 70s, and I arrived to teach at Leicester in 1991 just as Jack was leaving. So to kind of paraphrase von Clausewitz, and this seems like a good place to paraphrase von Clausewitz, I'm effectively the continuation of Jack Spence by other means. Andy Warhol famously said that everyone is famous for 15 minutes, and that's just about the time I've got today that Nick's allocated to me. So you're looking at my 15 minutes of fame here. So what I want to try and do in that 15 minutes or so, rather than to attempt the impossible and give a detailed account of the book, I hope people will pick up a copy for that. What I want to do is simply focus on the central arguments, and let me try and capture the central argument for you. Certainly, although Africa has been and continues to be a core South African foreign policy priority, and whilst South Africa has consistently recognised that it cannot flourish as an island of progress, prosperity and stability in a wider African sea of turmoil, conflict and poor governance, that recognition has been, we've heard that across all three presidencies. The fact remains that in the post-1994 period, the democratic period, I think South Africa has struggled to fashion an Africa policy which has managed to simultaneously advance its national interest, prioritise and promote its values, and meet its obligations to Africa. It's consistently struggled to translate material power into tangible foreign policy achievements on the continent. And we have seen, and I wouldn't wish to disregard successes, we have seen those too, but we have seen a number of high-profile failures on the continent under the three presidents the book looks at, in Mandela, Mbeki and Zuma. So that really brings me to the centrepiece of the book, which is the argument made throughout the text that South Africa has not been, is not, and will not be a hegemonic power in Africa. It will not be the leading power, and has not been the leading power. And I think hegemony is a term which is often used rather loosely and inaccurately and mistakenly about South Africa, activities in Africa. To be considered a hegemonic power, South Africa would certainly have to view itself as a hegemon and view itself as the leading power on the continent. It would have to have sufficient material power, both economic and military, to make those leadership aspirations credible. It would have to be able to convince other African states to accept its leadership as beneficial. In other words, it would have to inspire a followership in Africa. It would have to have a strong ideational appeal, which would allow it to build African coalitions and African institutions which are expressions of South African norms and values. And the book argues essentially that when measured against those benchmarks or criteria, South Africa falls short and fails to meet the requirements of hegemony. Yes, it's true it's economically hegemonic within the Southern African Customs Union. That's undoubtedly true, although that does not always guarantee political compliance from the member states, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia and Swaziland. Within the broader SADC zone, the Southern African Development Community, it's a qualified hegemon, but that has not prevented a range of diplomatic failures in that zone in the post-94 period, in Angola, in the DRC, and I would argue at least Zimbabwe since 2000. Beyond the SADC, South Africa I see as an important state, but not one which is approaching hegemony. Yes, the country's capabilities are still much greater than those of most other African states, but I argue it lacks the depth of power and the gravitational pull, the appeal to draw states into its orbit, which is a characteristic of the true hegemon. So let me make 3 quick points as to why I feel South Africa has been and continues to be incapable of hegemony or a preeminent leadership role on the continent. The first, and really it's the most obvious, is to say that South Africa has been reluctant to assume that role for good historical reasons. And the principal historical reason is the long shadow cast by the regional aggression, lawlessness and militarism of the apartheid regime in the 1980s, known as destabilisation, which inflicted such enormous destruction on the infrastructure and the economies of neighbouring states. Consequently, the new South Africa has been highly sensitive to regional concerns. It's been anxious to avoid any behaviour which might be characterised as coercive, and it has displayed an exaggerated deference to neighbouring states rather than seeking to lead and be assertive in the promotion of its values. Almost, if you like, a culture of overcompensation. The second point I want to make is that far from inspiring followership in Africa, the new South Africa has actually generated significant levels of resentment, suspicion, distrust and even opposition from other African states. And even in Southern Africa itself, there's been no automatic acceptance of South African positions. Now, what has contributed to that? Well, the book argues that there is some resistance to the idea that South Africa can and should speak for Africa, that it somehow should represent Africa, whether in its terms as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, or as the only African member of the G20 and the BRICS, or as a member of the IBSA Forum. African states contest the view that the South African interest is synonymous with the wider African interest. And paradoxically, the idea that South Africa is Africa's natural leader, to borrow a phrase from American foreign policy discourse, the indispensable nation, is an idea that's more enthusiastically supported outside of the continent than from within it. Another major source of resentment which the book discusses are the xenophobic attacks on African citizens living in informal settlements and the townships of South Africa, which peaked in 2008 and 2015, and which have seen thousands of people driven from their homes, and in 2008 over 60 people murdered. That has been absolutely toxic for South Africa's image and standing on the continent. And it offers a very, very sharp contrast with the support which South Africans received in Africa during the anti-apartheid struggle, the sanctuary, the solidarity they received. And it confirmed the view of some, at least, that South Africa is a state which is in Africa but not truly of Africa, an accusation which was often levelled at the apartheid regime. So the senior figures in the ANC cannot be expected to welcome that. There's also resentment at continuing economic imbalances. Despite South Africa's moralistic talk of partnership, trade policy is often viewed as self-interested, opportunistic, and serving to entrench rather than address historic inequalities. So we find big South African trade surpluses within the SADC, South Africa exporting 6 times more than it imports, and outside of the SADC that falls to just 5. It exports 5 times more than it imports. There's also resentment at South African corporate expansion. the expansion of the South African corporate footprint in Africa, with South African companies viewed often rather one-dimensionally, I think, as arrogant, predatory, colonisers. These phrases have become, we hear them with monotonous regularity. I don't think that does full justice to the role they play on the continent, but the perception is deeply embedded, and it contaminates so-called brand South Africa. South Africa's democratic values, I think, have limited traction on the continent. The much lauded constitution, the independent judiciary, free elections, a thriving civil society. And the book argues that since the Mandela era, South Africa has gradually abandoned an energetic promotion of those values in Africa, whether bilaterally or multilaterally. And instead, South Africa has looked to situate itself within an African consensus, which has often been authoritarian and even anti-democratic, rather than seeking to shape a new consensus. And human rights and attention to democratisation have been downgraded under both Mbeki and Zuma. Downgraded it, the book argues, in favour of old, more kind of statist concepts, very rigid, very narrow definitions of sovereignty, and non-interference in a state's internal affairs. And this became very pronounced under Mbeki. Foreign policy often viewed through a rather shrill anti-imperialist, anti-Western lens, in which the rights of African regimes were often prioritised over the rights of African people. The book also questions the what I feel is a rather complacent assumption that the South African model of conflict resolution enjoys universal adulation in Africa. And there is a danger there, I think, of South Africa believing its own publicity. And indeed, I argue that South Africa's promotion of governments of national unity in Africa, that promotion is often crass and indulgent of those who are refusing to accept the verdict of the ballot box. And I think South Africa, to some extent, has misread the lessons of its own settlement. And the third and final point I want to make in this short address is that the book argues that whatever its previous power, South Africa increasingly lacks the material capacity for hegemony and preeminence in Africa. Its economy has lots of structural flaws. It is afflicted by chronically low rates of growth, last year below 1%, hobbling along at around about the same forecasts for 2018. IMF forecasts over the next few years are between 1% and 3%, which simply doesn't cut it in terms of addressing the country's unemployment crisis. The figure for 2017 being 27.7% of people unemployed, and the belief is that is an underestimate. Youth unemployment is, of course, even higher. We've got the South African economy having suffered successive downgrades by the ratings agencies for reasons which are very complex, but one of which at least is the dysfunctional nature of the Zuma presidency. Yes, the country's made some economic progress. One can't deny that in terms of provision of water, electricity, housing, keeping people out of absolute poverty with social grants, but it has yet to be fundamentally transformed. There are high rates of absolute poverty. 21.7% of South Africans are living in absolute poverty, about 12 million people. And there are, as we know, grotesque inequalities. So what that failure to transform means, the book argues, is that it reduces South Africa's weight, its authority, its voice in Africa and the global South. South Africa sees itself as a scourge of global apartheid. It sees itself as a voice of the poor and the marginalised, and I think that its failure to transform its own society is damaging in that respect. But perhaps more importantly, I argue that this will necessitate a turn inwards. If I can paraphrase an old rogue, John Vorster, something of an inward movement, a refocusing of the country's energies on its congested domestic agenda at the expense of a deep and sustained engagement in Africa, particularly, I argue, as the failure to transform South Africa's own society is now exacting a political and electoral price for the ANC. And we need look no further than the local government elections of 2016 for that. with the ANC vote falling to 54%, its lowest of the democratic era, and its dominance is no longer unquestionable. So it's a matter of political survival, I think, that the South African Renaissance be prioritised over the African Renaissance. As Graham Evans argued way back in 1999, setting the outside world to rights ought to be a sequel, not a prologue, to setting the inside world to rights. Final point I want to make in the talk is to just mention the South African National Defence Force and to refer to the South African Defence Review of 2014, which painted a very alarming picture of a defence force which is in a critical state of decline. Underfunded, ill-equipped, an army, we were told, which was incapable of conducting combat operations, and a critically underfunded air force. So the report, the 2015 review, called for substantial investment over the short, medium and longer term to rebuild South African military capability so it can carry out its core functions of border defence, coastal patrol and engagement in African peace operations. And the phrase was heard around the discussion of this report, if you will the ends, you must will the means, which we heard a lot of in the 1990s with the United Nations. The report stated very clearly, South Africa must either make the resources available, the government must make the resources available to the Defence Force to deliver on its mandate, or scale down its ambitions. The problem was, and the problem is, the review's recommendations are disconnected from contemporary South African political realities. There is simply no surge of enthusiasm in South Africa, perhaps beyond the military itself, for substantial increases in the defence budget. Certainly no significant constituencies in the ANC support that, given the priorities elsewhere. I mentioned in the book a nice quote from Greg Mills when he says on this issue, those, for example, scraping by in the Eastern Cape on a combination of child support grants, remittances or state pensions and the protein of bones at £5 a bag will take some convincing of the benefits to them of fighters and corvettes at 350 million rand and 2.5 billion rand respectively. So what we see 3 years later on from the Defence Review is that the Defence Secretary Sam Galooby noted in a very stark statement last year, the resources available to the SANDF are no longer adequate to ensure the territorial integrity of our country is adequately secured. Note there, he's not saying the resources available are no longer adequate to engage in African peace operations. They're no longer adequate to ensure the territorial integrity of the country is adequately secured. So whilst I certainly accept that hegemony involves much more than military force, much more than military power, nonetheless, military capability does still stand at the heart of any hegemonic project. And in South Africa, that capability is being eroded and is withering away. As Guy Martin said in 2017 in the publication Defence Web, one does not do more with less, one does less with less. So what does all of that point to? What the book argues at the end is a kind of new multipolarity in Africa, a new pluralism. South Africa is one of many, a number of states, but certainly not the leader or even first among equals. Now the big question, to which I don't know the answer incidentally, so it's pointless anyone asking me this question, but Jack will probably know, he almost certainly will, is whether this will produce a stable consensus. Will it produce a harmonious kind of concert of powers to advance the African agenda, or will it lead to discord, fragmentation, gridlock, what Richard Haas called in the United States foreign policy context a kind of non-polarity? And where will South Africa fit into that? And what will Cyril Ramaphosa mean to this whole debate? Those are the kind of issues which we need to think about moving forward. Thank you very much.
James, thank you. I'm sure you've given plenty of people to bite into, but before they do so, Professor Spence, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. May I say, first of all, can you all hear me? All right, if you can't, just shout or don't throw anything. But may I say, first of all, how pleased I am to be here, to have this splendid opportunity to lead discussion of James Hamill's excellent study of South Africa's present standing both in Africa and the wider community. I'd also like to thank our chairman, Gaynor Roberts, for being so helpful in setting up this particular meeting and making it possible for me and others to discuss these very interesting issues. I've known James for a very long time. I must declare an interest. He was a pupil, he was a friend, still is, thank God, a colleague, and we've even published together on occasion. And I was absolutely delighted to be asked to read his volume for the IISS, and was very excited by its contents. It seems to me a most apposite study, particularly on leadership, because after all the title is Africa's Lost Leader. You've all read reports in the paper about the possibility of President Zuma being forced out of power and succeeded by Cyril Ramaphosa. And so the book is entirely relevant and appropriate at the time of publication, because it does give us insights into the structures and processes of South African politics at this very critical time in its history. I think the book's also valuable, if I may say so, because South Africa doesn't have anything like the share of media coverage that it's had during the apartheid years and immediately into Mandela's presidency. It doesn't get anything like the coverage that Mandela and others had to their credit. So that a book like this is very valuable because it does bring together all the current argument, all the current debate about South Africa. And I think its strength, if I may say so, is that it's written in a sparkling way, but also there's a sense of detachment in the analysis. And finally, there are some helpful suggestions about how things might change for the better. In other words, it's a book that any academic teaching in this field would clearly want to recommend strongly to all his students, postgraduates, undergraduates, to his colleagues, and indeed it would have a wider interest, a very considerable wider interest for those involved in the study of African politics and South Africa in particular. As James makes clear in the book, when the apartheid regime gave way to the new democratic South Africa, the hope among many liberals, and here I include myself, was that the newly established government of national unity would, as it were, follow what you might describe, in single quotes, as a liberal foreign policy. It would carve out for itself a liberal niche which would enable the new government to demonstrate a commitment to play a new and constructive and helpful role in the region, the Southern African region, but also the wider African continent and indeed the world. In other words, the new leaders of South Africa, and that still persists, I think, in the leadership today and may go on under Ramaphosa, the new leadership had aspirations to be a state very different from the apartheid regime, but one which could do good things, liberal things, abroad, in the region, in the continent, on the continent, and of course in the wider international society. And in some ways, I suppose, some of us at the time hoped that South Africa might emulate those states who are small but have what is called, a famous phrase which I cribbed and plagiarized time and time again, have a rectitude base. It's a phrase I think made famous by an American academic, Mary Baker Fox, many years ago. But it's a helpful phrase because what it suggests is that if you're going to cut a figure in international relations, either regionally or internationally, then it's a good idea, in fact it's pretty well essential, to have a sound domestic base, a democratic base, respect of human rights in your own country, and also evidence of genuine economic progress and development. And I think many of us hoped that South Africa could emulate the example of, for example, the Scandinavian states, Canada, Switzerland, and to a degree the papacy. And despite the smallness of the country, it's not a great power by any standards, despite that, it would have the possibility of playing a role, especially in the area of trying to settle Chapter 6 disputes using techniques such as mediation and so forth. And I think, to some extent, as James has quite clearly observed and rightly observed, that rectitude base has, to a degree, been eroded by events within South Africa and, of course, in the wider area. I mean, the difficulty for South Africa in some respects is that it lives or works or has to exist in a rough neighbourhood, as somebody once put it. I think Chester Crocker called it that, a rough neighbourhood. It's there it is on the continent. Bear in mind, there are over 50 states on the African continent. If you think the European Union has problems with 27, think of what a small state, or relatively small state like South Africa, has to face in whatever strategy or policy it adopts. It has to deal with a multitude of states, different ideologies, different attitudes, different levels of development, different international aspirations, very often plagued by civil war. Not a happy or interesting neighbourhood, a complex, difficult one. And of course the other advantage that the states I've just mentioned, these so-called good citizens of international society, is that they could, and still do, put themselves forward as sources of aid and technical assistance, and have at least a degree of trustworthiness on the part of the international society as a whole, that this aid is very often given, mostly given without strings attached. Now the hope was that South Africa might play that role. Now it seems to me that what James's book does is demonstrate that this rectitude base has been eroded to a degree for internal and external reasons. And it may be that it's worth just trying to summarize very briefly some of the reasons, not all of them, some of the reasons why that rectitude base has been eroded, and why, as I put it, although I think James to some extent disagrees with me in the book, and that's fair enough, why South Africa has in some respects, and I'll concede this point to James, has become just another country in the eyes of the outside world, media commentary and everything else. That isn't to say that it doesn't have special characteristics which are still impressive. When people come to me and say, I'm going to South Africa, I want to visit, what do I look for? Why is it different from the past? And the one good thing I can say about South Africa, and I think it's true, correct me if I'm wrong, James, is that the one thing you don't have to fear if you live in modern South Africa today is the knock at the door at midnight. Arbitrary arrest and arbitrary punishment. I think that particular chunk of the rectitude base, la plank if you like, still exists to its credit. Mm-hmm. But if you're asking, why has South Africa faced these particular problems? Well, one is, I think, simply overstretch. The country, the government, quite understandably when Mandela came to power, and also under Thabo Mbeki's administration, felt they had a contribution to make, that they were a special kind, as exceptional state, as James remarks, which because of its background, because it had got rid of apartheid by peaceful, coercive diplomacy, but also good, long, 4-year-long discussion. Because of that, it had a special contribution to make, both to the region and to the continent and the world as a whole. In other words, the doctrine of South African exceptionalism. But the problem there was that they were trying to do too much, it seems to me. They were guilty, if you like, of overstretch. They lacked the kind of resources which one might measure in terms of skilled manpower and economic, diplomatic and military capability. I mean, they had all those things, but not perhaps to the degree they would have liked to play that kind of dynamic, robust, liberal role in Africa and elsewhere. And secondly, I think the other difficulty about this erosion, as I say, of the rectitude base, which James discusses in immensely useful, helpful detail, is that there has been a decline, I think there's no doubt about that, in the quality of leadership in South Africa. President Zuma has been accused, rightly or wrongly, we don't know the full outcome, of corruption at a variety of levels, and there's great pressure within certain quarters of the ANC to get him out of power. And certainly the new leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, is, as far as we know from reading press reports, making every effort to make his exit sooner rather than later. And the hope is, it is a hope, and James refers to it, the hope is that Ramaphosa will display qualities which make up for the decline in leadership in the past, under Zuma in particular. And he comes with pretty good credentials. You know, he was a very prominent trade unionist, very successful. He's a tough negotiator. He was a very successful businessman. He was apparently Mandela's choice initially for succession when he decided to retire, but for all sorts of reasons I won't go into, Thabo got the nod. And Ramaphosa said, right, I'm off to make some money, which he did in great quantities. But did it, as far as we know, by sheer skill and not by any corrupt means. So there is some hope that with him in power, things might change for the better. The difficulty is, actually, and I think James makes this point somewhere, the difficulty is that the ANC is hopelessly divided between his supporters, Ramaphosa's supporters, and also Zuma's supporters. And whether those two groups can come together in time for the next election is a matter of guesswork at this stage. The one thing we do know about him, I'm pretty certain, and I hope I'm right here, is that he's not corrupt. He's never displayed any hint of personal corruption. The third thing, I think, which I would want to comment on, which James does discuss in his book, is these aspirations to be greater and bigger and more powerful than you really are. And one example of that is South Africa joining the BRICS. I've always been a bit sceptical about that, about South Africa's membership of the BRICS and what goodies would come its way as a consequence of that membership. There is, after all, a huge disparity between the BRICS, the original BRICS. They're incipient, and they are, in many respects, great power superpowers. China, India, Russia, Brazil is a powerful state, certainly in its own region and beyond. There's a huge disparity between the resources, economic, political, military, diplomatic, open to those countries in their dealings with the outside world, and South Africa. South Africa, it seems to me, tags along in the wake of these BRICS. They're not, Merle Lipton, who's here happily this afternoon, has written very perceptively about the BRICS in an article recently in the South African Institute's journal, International Affairs, their journal. And she might well want to comment on this subsequently. But what strikes me about them is that they are not revolutionaries. The BRICS, and you can't really be a revolutionary in modern international relations. You can't change the whole state system overnight or over a period of years. You can be a reformer, you can try and get changes of a reformist kind in particular areas of the international society, but revolutionaries they are not. And they are not necessarily all in complete agreement about the kind of world they want, and also in terms of day-to-day strategy, in terms of day-to-day policy. And I wonder, I may be wrong here, and I'm open to argument, believe me, I wonder what benefits really accrue from BRICS membership. Isn't it a case of an aspiration which really has no chance of great fulfillment? So what more can I say, except that I do urge you to read this book. It's come at an apposite moment in the history of South Africa. It's very well researched. My God, James, you appear to have read everything that's ever been written in the last 20 years about South Africa.
It feels like that.
I'm sure it does. But it's very well researched, and the sources are superb, so that if you want to go on and look at something beyond what James has been saying, the source will be there to help you find that. So I do recommend this book to you, and hope that you will buy it and read it and recommend it to friends, colleagues, pupils, students, practitioners, or whoever. But thank you very much again for giving me the opportunity to pronounce on this really first-rate study. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I think I should get you to come along and be discussing for all our books.
That's kind.
Who would like to make a question or a comment? I think maybe if we take them in twos or threes. Yes, please say first.
James, my own take on South African foreign policy is that it's very much president-driven. And if you share that view, would you care to comment on your book's take on whether there's been evolution, decline, or a series of disjunctures between the three presidents? Has there been continuity? Has there been change? How best to look at the presidents and their foreign policies? I can think of three possibilities: evolution, decline. Jack who was talking in terms of decline. He was really talking, I think, about personal characteristics, but there's also things like goals, the assignment of material to goals, and so on and so forth. So I can think of evolution, I can think of decline, and I can also think simply of a series of more or less random disjunctures. I'd be interested to hear what you would take.
Okay, let's take them into twos or threes. Yes, please.
Sure. Well, firstly, if I could just say thank you. This is the subject of my thesis, so a great deal of trawling through articles. But if I could ask about the Defence Force in particular, sort of the fortunes of the Defence Force seem to have a lot in common with the new South Africa itself, in that there were very celebrated peace support interventions in Lesotho and Burundi, but now it sort of seems to be an organisation deprived of funds and struggling with commitments it cannot keep. So my question is, to what extent has the Defence Force had agency in formulating South African foreign policy since 1994?
Do you have a third one this round? Yes, sir, and then I'll continue.
Actually, just to follow up on the first question, I mean, a little bit more progression there. One great example, you talked about kind of this aggressive leadership in kind of post-94 foreign policy, leading from behind, making other countries look, trying to at least not take that leading role. Then a few years ago, I think in 14 or so, they aggressively pushed Lamini Zuma as the AU chair. I mean, left blood on the floor, alienated the Francophone country. So again, getting back to that, who's been minding the store for the last 10 years on foreign policy? Because it's a question I've been asking, and I've never gotten a very good answer.
No. Well, I don't think anyone knows the answer to that, because I think that question goes beyond foreign affairs as to who's been minding the store over the last 10 years. It's all rather chaotic and at times random. And certainly one doesn't have the impression that the current foreign minister has been particularly attentive to minding the store at all. So that's I think that's a problem, a kind of systemic problem across the whole policy spectrum, whether domestic or foreign. I don't think there's any sense, and one of the things I tried to make clear in the book, which kind of ties in with the question you asked at the back about evolution of policy and different presidents, is that Zuma there's nothing out there which suggests a kind of Zuma doctrine. I don't see even the broad contours of a Zuma doctrine. Whereas with Mbeki, I could see that this was a foreign policy president, someone very much with his hands on the tiller, interested, intimately engaged in foreign affairs, and clearly well versed in foreign affairs. I don't have that impression with Zuma on foreign affairs at all, other than the jewel in his crown is that South Africa joined BRICS, though Jack has cast doubt on the value of that. But I wonder how much of the groundwork for that was laid in the Mbeki era anyway. So I don't think there's any sense that in foreign affairs that anyone's really minding the store, but that's a characteristic of the Zuma era as a whole across the board. I think in terms of the evolution of policy under different leaders, I think there's the message of the book, really, Jack referred to this again, is that the policy, the South African foreign policy clearly evolved away from the kind of things Mandela was talking about even before he came to office, the famous 1993 Foreign Affairs article where he talked about human rights being the light that guides our foreign affairs. And I don't think that was ever operationalised perfectly ideally, with lots of hypocrisies and inconsistencies as one would expect. That would be difficult in even the most benign global circumstances. But there was some kind of commitment to the rectitude base, to use the phrase Jack drew upon. And I think under Mbeki and Zuma, so the clear rupture, I think, is from Mandela to Mbeki. I think there's much greater continuity between Zuma and Mbeki in terms of how South Africa views the world. Mbeki initially, I felt, was a promising foreign policy president who was looking to continue the kind of diplomacy of the Mandela era and position South Africa as a kind of mediator, good international citizen, bridge builder, but seemed to cool on that. Certainly from about, probably as the Zimbabwe crisis intensified, Mbeki's foreign policy evolved in a much more strident, shrill, ideologically partisan direction, anti-Western direction. You see that with his statements on Zimbabwe, but you also see it with regard to Sudan as well. Now, why does Mbeki suddenly move to that position? I think requires further investigation. I don't give that a lot of attention in the book. I think there are different schools of thought out there about it. One is Patrick Bond. Some people here will have heard of Patrick Bond, University of KwaZulu-Natal, arguing that essentially what Mbeki was doing was talking left and walking right, so that he needed a kind of militancy in his discourse at some level to deflect criticism from his domestic economic policies, which were seen as neoliberal and conformist. So this kind of militant globalist rhetoric on international affairs was seen as a kind of consolation prize for people. And I think in Zuma, initially we didn't quite know what to expect. Has kind of continued in that vein, really. There hasn't been any great shift in direction on the question of Zimbabwe. And of course, it's under Zuma that South Africa's announced it's going to leave the International Criminal Court, and under Zuma's presidency, where al-Bashir was allowed to leave South Africa in 2015, rather than be apprehended and brought before the ICC or handed over to the ICC. So I would see the big difference. Policy has evolved away from where it was in the Mandela period, and the continuity we see is between Mbeki and Zuma. And what I would also say, though, is there is some convergence between Zuma and Mandela in terms of their approach to these things. And Mbeki was very much hands-on, very diligent, very much a kind of energetic head of government. I think kind of Mandela and Zuma dip in and out of this. So Mandela wasn't always very attentive to foreign affairs and would often infuriate people by announcing policy at press conferences or in interviews with the media or conversations with foreign leaders. He would kind of circumvent the chain of command. And Mbeki was much more kind of organised and systematic in his approach. And I think under Zuma we've gone back to that kind of dipping in and out thing. He's a rather kind of lazy, inattentive leader who doesn't like detail and who simply doesn't have any policy substance. No, that's fine.
Now, I'm just going to add to what James, I think, quite rightfully has stressed, that South Africa had the problem, still does in a way, but right at the beginning it was clear that on the one hand you needed all the help you could get from the rich north, the west, aid, investment, everything else. They were the obvious source. And were willing, obviously, to use South Africa as a base for such economic development and for profit. So that was one, if you like, imperative or one constraint operating upon South Africa at the time, and it still does. On the other hand, South Africa understandably wanted to be a leader of what was called the Third World, but the South, and by the South, it was Africa that was meant. And those two imperatives driving policy aren't easily reconciled. And that's just a structural problem about which you can't do very much. But certainly there was I think those competing imperatives which made South African foreign policy difficult. Mbeki, I think James is right. Mbeki, whatever one might say about him, he's a very interesting politician. He's someone one would enjoy debating these matters with. He was clever, able, he was well educated in this country. He had skills of considerable substance, and he was someone one felt one could talk to and argue with and discuss these matters, and he would be very polite, very courteous, but very forceful in the way he responded. And the contrast between him and Zuma strikes me as being, as James rightly says, strikes me as being extraordinary. It's sad, really.
Yeah. Your question about the Defence Force and the agency of that, I think the Defence Force was at its strongest in terms of influence in the Mandela government when it had Modise and Ronnie Kasrils as quite it's kind of metaphor for the new South Africa, really, isn't it? That Modise and Kasrils were the head and deputy head of the Defence Ministry, who were giving orders to the generals who 5 years earlier were trying to kill them and kill each other. It kind of sums it up nicely. But I think that was the period where the Defence Force had some clout in policy debates, and that was reflected in we now look back upon this as the original sin of the new South Africa, the arms deal of 1998-99, the decision to refurbish the Defence Force, which led to the sleaze, the scandal, which still haunts Zuma and others to this day. But I think since then, the Defence Force has lacked kind of clout in those bureaucratic arguments, and I don't see in this. This is why I argued that the Defence Review of 2014 just is disconnected from reality. I don't see anyone out there in government actively championing the cause of huge increases in the defence budget. But more than that, there aren't even constituencies out there in the opposition campaigning for that. The Democratic Alliance made clear that this was, in their phrase, a non-starter. And the Economic Freedom Fighters predictably repudiated this, and their agenda is to outflank and outmaneuver the ANC to the left. So we'd never expect them to endorse increased defence expenditure. So I think that they don't have a great deal of clout in internal ANC debates. And I think that the last point at which they did have any real serious clout was in the Modise Kasrils period.
Okay. Let's go back for another round of questions. Yes, thank you.
As you were saying about the South African Defence Force is quite weak, the economy is weak, and it's basically kind of in stock terms like a very cheap share. Now, the positioning, the geopolitical positioning of South Africa in the current stage is not very high, but say, for example, in a different scenario where the Suez Canal was to shut down, then there could be an increase of global importance of the positioning of South Africa. So do you think, and of course then the relationships between China and Russia and South Africa, Russia specifically with the nuclear deal, there's quite a lot of interest because I think they sense that it's available to sell, essentially. Do you think that particular scenario will have any sort of impact? It's obviously an unlikely scenario, but do you think that the fact that it is quite cheap at the moment will affect? Do you think we'll see? How do you think that will play out in the future?
So your point is that the possibility of the Suez Canal being kind of Nasser type.
So if there was any instability in the Middle East that was to close the Suez Canal, then you'd have a lot of trade going past the southern Africa.
Thus making South Africa more strategically significant.
Yeah, and although it's a non-expectant outcome, it is in the realm of risk analysis. It's one scenario that could potentially play out, and obviously if there was something with Korea or whatever the case.
Yeah, it's not something I've addressed in the book, and it's a very, very difficult question. Well, I don't want to give him a hospital pass here, but the man to my left, two to my left, was written about this extensively. In the past, you'll recall this writing about the strategic significance of South Africa, didn't you?
Yes, indeed.
And when this was the hot topic, wasn't it? In the event of the Cold War becoming a hot war, and problems in usually it was the Cape trade route, the Cape Sea route, could become a major cockpit of Cold War confrontation. I haven't, in my work, addressed the issue of the current instability in the Middle East, or where that will place South Africa. I'm not sure I entirely understand what you're trying to get at in terms of what will it mean for South Africa's significance, or South Africa's salience, its global kind of punch.
Yeah, I suppose from a foreign policy area, do you disagree that is it prone? Could it be prone to outside influence of that nature? And I suppose what would it happen?
Well, I think if South Africa's a member of the BRICS group, it's certainly prone to Russian influence. That's very clear, and that's been something which Zuma has put people in place to try and fast track that nuclear deal. I think that's really a cause for concern. And the close gravitation towards China one can see on an economic basis, but the close gravitation towards Russia is more difficult to explain, I think, and kind of confirms that move away from any kind of emphasis on good governance, democracy, and human rights. So I think that if South Africa is a again, Merle might have something to say about this, but there has to be some kind of condition as South Africa being a member of BRICS. It has to mean some obligation to its fellow members, loyalty to those fellow members when those other members are in dispute with states outside of the BRICS. To what extent is there an expectation that South Africa will fall in line with other BRICS members as opposed to doing its own thing, and that BRICS membership is simply a loose affiliation? Jack seemed to suggest he didn't really take it that seriously as a foreign policy instrument. I don't know in terms of where we are with BRICS on that, but Merle might have some thoughts.
Yes.
And you may have some thoughts, Jack, on the strategic issue.
Merle has written about this link. What's your view?
Well, let me pass on that complex question, which is now in a state of extreme fluidity due to the accession of Ramaphosa, whose foreign policy stance we don't know anything about yet, excepting it's less likely to be close to the BRICS because he's likely to be less anti-Western, and he is not likely to to go ahead with this nuclear deal with Russia, which was very, very significant in the South African relationship with the BRICS. Can I raise another point which both of you raised in your excellent and thoughtful presentations, and that is the rectitude dimension. Now, as James has strongly argued in his book, and Jack has also taken up, a very important dimension of South Africa's soft power was this rectitude dimension, the Mandela emphasis on human rights, etc., from which they have backed away. Now, the opposition Democratic Alliance, the leader, Maimane, has made much of that issue and has been instrumental and is now the leader of an organization in Southern Africa which stands against the SADC line of keeping mum on actually supporting, conniving at authoritarianism and sovereignty which protects us, etc. And he has stressed the need for human rights, etc. And we saw him being very active on that in his intervention in Zambia. Now, what is your impression of how this is playing in the region? Clearly there is a constituency there, and recent developments suggest that that constituency for democracy, human rights, good governance is growing in strength. So how do you see this playing out? Have you any observations about reactions in the region and how this might push Ramaphosa himself?
Yes, I'm sort of the emerging civil society in the region, as you say, a lot of grassroots groups seeking to promote democracy. Those have tended thus far to be marginalised by South Africa. South Africa's approach is what, again, to come back to the argument, is what I call statist. It privileges incumbent regimes instinctively, and that fits in very nicely with the traditional SADC narrative to date, which is that this is a kind of leaders' club despite the charters of the Charter of the SADC, which is waxes lyrical about democracy and good government. In practice, they hang together, and Zimbabwe is the most obvious expression of that. There's obviously been no possibility that Zuma is remotely interested in engaging those groups. But Ramaphosa, I think there is a possibility of engaging, insofar as we know anything so far about his foreign policy. I would suspect you're right, that it's likely to be much more pragmatic. He'll retreat from the doctrinaire approach of both Mbeki and Zuma, and maybe more instinctively inclined to be sympathetic to those type of organisations. Why? The thing that occurs to me as to possibly why is his background is very different from Zuma and Mbeki. And Zuma and Mbeki largely a product of the exile tradition in the ANC, and it's with its whole kind of top-down commandist style of politics. That's their modus operandi in exile, and that certainly has spilled over into the post-94 period. Whereas Ramaphosa comes from the more people may disagree with me on this, more democratic grassroots tradition. He comes from the trade union movement, where there's a tradition of debate and consultation and leadership being accountable to the membership. And also he was closely involved with the UDF mass democratic movement. And though the UDF and the mass democratic movement are not dissimilar, if we think back on those organisations, to the type of organisation you're referring to now in Southern Africa. And I think Ramaphosa will probably not want to allow Mamani to make the running on that. And he'll see the dangers that Mamani poses across a number of areas, and will want to neutralise that. And certainly I certainly hope, we don't know, he is something of a blank sheet in foreign policy, but I'd like to think there would be a movement back, at least, in the direction of a more emancipatory outlook towards regional politics. What worries me about Ramaphosa, which probably worries everyone, is that his victory was very narrow,
yes,
and therefore his authority is questionable, and he faces a divided ANC top six and a divided National Executive Committee. Now that may change, and people may move towards Ramaphosa, who are currently aligned with Zuma because they see the way the wind's blowing, and that Zuma is yesterday's man, and Ramaphosa is the man of tomorrow. And he might be able to bring more people on board because of that. That worries me, but I think instinctively, I think it's more likely that he can pursue that more emancipatory line, and that's one of the chief reasons why I welcomed his victory over NDZ, who said famously that as long as the ANC is in power, it will never criticise ZANU-PF. And I hope that we're through that era.
Can I just make one point in support of what Will is saying? I mean, Ramaphosa was a superb trade union leader at a difficult time, under apartheid and so forth. He ran rings around the Chamber of Mines. He looked after his workers and acquired an enormous reputation for skillful negotiation. And I suspect he's still got that skill at his fingertips, and that is a great asset. I don't think Zuma was a great negotiator, not really in that context. But Ramaphosa does at least have status and standing. He's achieved a good deal in his life. And those negotiating skills are going to be crucial. It will be fascinating, I think, to watch him, to see what he does in the field of foreign policy. He's hedged around with constraints, as James rightly says. The ANC is divided. There's no unanimity on what foreign policy should be. But if anybody can make a breakthrough of substance, it seems to me he's your man.
Yeah, he's a much more able and accomplished individual.
Yeah.
But you could argue that the bar hasn't been set very high.
Yeah.
Okay, we have three questions now at the back. We'll go in order, please. First,
how has the relationship between business and government domestically impacted South Africa's ability to pursue what it calls its economic diplomacy? And so what can we expect from Cyril Ramaphosa regionally when we've got new presidents in Angola and Zimbabwe who are, for their own domestic support, pursuing mandate of economic renewal and recovery in the region. And the other one is you beat up a lot on the SANDF, but is there anything in terms of that transition period, is there anything in terms of security sector reform or civil-military relations, are there any lessons learned there that South Africa can export into the region in the same way that they exported the TRC model of mediation?
Yeah, I'm not sure what Ramaphosa's thinking will be on the post-Dos Santos leadership in Angola or Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe. It kind of links back to what I was saying in response to Merle. I think looking at those two examples, from what I've read so far, I have rather more faith and confidence in the Angolan transition taking us somewhere, and Ramaphosa being able to cajole that and encourage it and help move it forward, than I do the Mnangagwa transition, which I'm not at all optimistic about. I see that as I see the agenda there as how to deliver, they realise they're in a crisis, they need external assistance, but how can we do the minimum politically to secure that assistance from South Africa and others? I think that's the agenda in Zimbabwe. It's I've tried to make this clear in a number of articles, but I don't have any faith that in the architects of Zimbabwe's demise suddenly reinventing themselves as its redeemers. So I'm very pessimistic about that. I'm a little bit more upbeat about Angola. I think there's something in play there, and that there's been an attempt to close down the patronage networks and the corruption of Isabel dos Santos and things like that. So I'd hope that he can play a role there. In terms of exporting the model of civil-military relations into the region, I think that's a really good idea. That is somewhere, a kind of niche area where South Africa could play a role in Africa without it being overly committed and overly expensive and overly engaged, that it could seek to promote that model of kind of subordination to constitutional authority and to the civilian leadership. Again, though, bringing us back to Zimbabwe, it's that's an inopportune moment there because it is the military that engineered the transition in Zimbabwe. So, there's no escaping the fact that the military placed itself as the central player in that transition, and now appears to have given itself a veto over the political process in Zimbabwe. So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to do there. I'm generally, though, skeptical. One of the things the book tries to do is it more than hints at this. It's quite explicit about it. But I'm very sceptical about the application of the South African model in the rest of Africa. I think that's quite a conceited view that South Africa has the answers, and all we have to do is roll out our GNU settlement every time there's a conflict. And I think what is happening is very often these conflicts are not receptive to that type of arrangement, and they're more of a zero-sum game arrangement. And I think that South Africa's, something I said earlier, is not applying the lessons of its own settlement. The Government of National Unity arrangement in South Africa after 1994 was agreed in advance at constitutional negotiations. It was part and parcel of the negotiated settlement. These GNUs it's promoting in Africa are very often hastily contrived contractions designed to reward people who simply refuse to leave power. And therefore I think that is an unfortunate precedent to be setting. It's a form of hostage taking, but if we are not given an important role in government, and in Zimbabwe's case the preeminent role in government despite being defeated, then we will unleash murder and mayhem. And I think South Africa has tacitly endorsed that, and I think it's misread the lessons of its own settlement. So I'm very cautious about exporting the South African model, because I don't necessarily think it is the South African model very often that is being exported to the rest of Africa, but that might be quite controversial.
If I may just follow up on what James has said there, I mean, the constitutional negotiations in South Africa, sitting around a table trying to get some agreement on what constituted their constitution, took 4 long years, and there were periodical breakdowns in those negotiations. And what I think was striking about those negotiations was the role of Western diplomats, and Russians for that matter, who very quietly and surreptitiously whenever those negotiations looked as if they were going to collapse, people walked out, wanted to call it a day. Whenever that happened, British, American, German, French ambassadors, high commissioners, not high commissioners, ambassadors, would very subtly and quietly put pressure on both sides. A combination, a wonderful combination of soft and hard power. It's a good example which I use to illustrate this issue to my students. Soft power in the sense that you were saying to those people when they fell apart in these long drawn out, and that's the point, they are long drawn out, they don't happen overnight or next month, they're 4 years of discussion. They were able to say, if you guys, girls, agree to a new constitution, well, the sky's the limit. We'll give you aid, economic assistance, resume trade, abandon sanctions, etc., etc. That's good soft power. If you don't, then we'll tell Mrs. Thatcher and she'll be very cross. I mean, that's putting it in a very simple-minded way. But the argument was, if you don't really settle this issue now and get a decent constitution going, a government of national unity, then be prepared for the outside world to say, well, look, we've done our best to get you lot to sort yourselves out. It hasn't worked. We're writing you off. Get on with it and do what you can. But the great argument that the West could use in trying to persuade both sides, as they did, not just during the negotiations, but in the 80s, the argument was, look, neither of you can win. Neither of you can lose. You're stalemated. Okay, at the end of the day, the African economy will collapse. Is that what you want? You want to inherit a wasteland. Now that argument was very telling, very convincing. Do you want to inherit a wasteland? And de Klerk and Mandela and all the others sitting around that table rationally, sensibly acknowledged that point, and that drove them back to go on talking. It's an extraordinary story, and James is right. I'm not sure you can simply replicate that in very different social, political, economic contexts, you know.
And it was rolled out, it was developed over 4 years before it was rolled out in 1994, whereas in Zimbabwe in 2008, this was as a result of the unleashing of state terror against the opposition. Let's be clear about that. That's what it was. The unleashing of state terror against the opposition, a simple refusal to accept the verdict of the ballot box. You might recall some of the statements at the time. The military saying they would never salute Changarai as leader, and Robert Mugabe's infamous statement, only God who appointed me will remove me, which he has.
Can't think of a better ending. I'm very sorry to the two who'd raised their hands. Maybe you'll get the chance to catch James at the end, but I have to bring it to a close here. I want to thank you all very much for coming and participating in the discussion. If you're an ISS member, your book is in the post. There are a few copies also available downstairs, and it's on Kindle if you prefer to get your books electronically rather than in the old format. Please join me in thanking both Jack Spence and